May 4th, 1943, 22:30 hours. North Atlantic, south of Greenland. The air inside U-628 is thick with the smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and recycled oxygen. It is the scent of the hunter, stale and predatory. Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich Hasenschar, his face illuminated by the pale green glow of the attack periscope's optics, feels the familiar thrum of the electric motors vibrating through the deck plates. For 6 days, his boat, part of the Wolfpack Fink, has been stalking convoy ONS-5 through a relentless gale. Now the storm has momentarily abated, and the sea is a mass of rolling black mountains under a sliver of moon. He grips the handles, his knuckles white. Through the lens, a scene of impossible scale materializes. Not a convoy, a city. A floating mobile city of steel stretching from one edge of his vision to the other. Dozens of dark lumbering shapes, merchantmen, plodding eastward, their silhouettes stark against the churning horizon. More ships than he has ever seen in one place. More targets than he has torpedoes. In his pocket, he can feel the corner of a letter from his wife, Liesel, its paper softened from repeated readings. She writes of their son, who asks when his father will come home a hero. Heinrich had imagined this moment, the moment of triumph that would justify the cold, the claustrophobia, the gnawing fear. He had imagined a glorious kill, but this is different. This isn't a formation. It's an inundation. The sheer number is an act of defiance, an industrial miracle steaming through the most dangerous waters on Earth. He hears the sonarman's tense voice announce another escort's ping, the rhythmic heartbeat of their stalker. The hunters are also the hunted. As he gives the order to align for a shot, a chilling thought, cold as the Atlantic itself, washes over him. It's not the escorts he fears, not truly. It's the horizon. It's the fact that beyond these 40 ships there are 40 more, and 40 more after that. He is looking at an enemy whose strength isn't just in its warships, but in its boundless, terrifying ability to build. He is a single wolf, facing a herd that never ever ends. The Second World War, for all its sweeping land campaigns and epic aerial duels, would be won or lost on the cold, gray expanse of the North Atlantic. This was not a battlefield of glory, but one of brutal, attritional logic. For Great Britain, it was the artery through which its lifeblood flowed. Every tank, every bullet, every can of food, every gallon of fuel, every soldier needed to make the perilous 3,000-mile journey from the arsenals of North America. Sever this artery, and the island nation would starve, its war machine grinding to a halt. Winston Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." From the German perspective, the Unterseebootwaffe, or U-boat arm, was the key to victory. Its commander, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, was a brilliant and ruthless strategist who understood the Atlantic's central importance. He eschewed the grand surface fleet battles of the past, focusing instead on a single stark objective: tonnage warfare. The concept was simple and brutal arithmetic. If his U-boats could sink merchant shipping faster than the Allies could build it, Britain would be forced to capitulate. He calculated the magic number at approximately 750,000 tons sunk per month. To achieve this, Dönitz perfected the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. Individual U-boats were too vulnerable. Instead, they would be spread out in long patrol lines across the convoy routes. The first U-boat to spot a convoy would not attack. It would shadow the target, transmitting its position back to U-boat command, the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, BDU, in France. Dönitz and his staff would then vector every available U-boat in the region toward the target, converging like wolves on a caribou. They would wait for the cover of night and then strike, often from the surface, where their low profiles made them incredibly difficult to spot. The primary weapon was the Type 7 U-boat, a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. At just over 220 feet long, it was a cramped, complex machine of war, carrying 14 torpedoes and a crew of around 44 men who lived for months in the most punishing conditions imaginable. The Allied response, born from the lessons of the First World War, was the convoy system. It was a simple, yet profound tactical choice. Gather the slow, vulnerable merchant ships into a massive herd and surround them with a screen of dedicated warships. The principle was concentration of force. A U-boat attacking a convoy would not be picking off a lone straggler. It would have to penetrate a layered defense of destroyers and corvettes, actively hunting it. These escorts were the sheepdogs. Early in the war, the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy bore the brunt, fielding whatever they could. This included old refitted destroyers and the newly designed Flower-class corvette, a small, slow and uncomfortable ship, but one that was cheap, quick to build, and perfectly suited for hunting submerged submarines with its primary weapon, ASDIC, an early form of sonar, and a deadly payload of depth charges. The convoys themselves were massive, complex undertakings. A typical formation could consist of 40 to 60 merchant ships arranged in a grid of multiple columns, steaming at a frustratingly slow 7 to 9 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel. The lifeline stretched from Halifax, Nova Scotia or New York to Liverpool or Murmansk. But the system had a critical vulnerability: the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or Black Pit. This was a vast stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based Allied anti-submarine aircraft from Iceland, Britain, or Newfoundland. In this gap, the wolf packs could roam and attack with near impunity, operating on the surface at night, safe from the eyes in the sky. It was here, in the heart of the Atlantic, that the battle would reach its devastating crescendo. For Private First Class Leo Nash, 19 years old from Cleveland, Ohio, the war had not yet smelled of gunpowder or mud. It smelled of salt, damp wool, and the faint ever-present odor of vomit from the bunks below. He was a passenger on the SS Robert E. Peary, a brand-new Liberty ship, just one of thousands being churned out by American shipyards. Crammed into the hold with 500 other GIs, he felt less like a soldier and more like cargo. The real cargo was below them: crates of .50 caliber ammunition, P-47 Thunderbolt wings, and enough K rations to feed a division. The Liberty ship was a marvel of production, not performance. Welded, not riveted, with a simple triple expansion steam engine, it was designed to be built in weeks by a workforce that included thousands of women who had never before held a welding torch. It was ugly, slow, and had a reputation for cracking in heavy seas. But it was the ship that would win the war. The United States would build over 2,700 of them, an industrial flood that Germany could simply not comprehend. Life on board was a monotonous cycle of waiting, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The ship groaned and creaked with every swell of the Atlantic, a constant weary sound. Days were spent cleaning rifles that were slick with condensation, playing cards and staring out at the identical gray waves and the dozens of other ships in the convoy, smokestacks painting the sky. They were a city just as Kapitän Leutnant Hasenschar had seen, but a fragile one. At night, a total blackout was enforced. No cigarettes on the deck, no lights, nothing that could betray their position to a predator lurking beneath the waves. The true soldiers of the Atlantic, however, were the merchant mariners. These were civilian volunteers, often too old or unfit for the regular armed services, who signed up for what was statistically the most dangerous job of the war. They received little recognition and were paid a fraction of what a factory worker made, yet they faced a higher casualty rate than any branch of the military, save the Marine Corps. They lived with the constant, gnawing knowledge that their ship, laden with thousands of tons of explosives or fuel, was the U-boat captain's primary target. They knew that a single torpedo could transform their world into a vortex of fire and freezing water in less than a minute. The alarm for action stations was a sound that seared itself into every man's memory. It was a frantic clanging bell that sent hearts pounding. Leo would scramble from his bunk, pulling on his life vest, fumbling in the dark, and heading to his assigned position on deck. There he could only watch and wait. He'd see the escorts, typically Fletcher-class destroyers or smaller corvettes, suddenly peel away from the convoy, their engines roaring as they charged toward an unseen enemy. Then would come the explosions, not the sharp crack of artillery, but the deep gut-wrenching whump of depth charges detonating far below the surface, sending massive plumes of water erupting into the air. Sometimes they would see the result, a dark oil slick spreading across the water, a sign of a kill. Other times the night would be illuminated by a horrific, brilliant flash on the horizon as another merchantman took a hit. A fireball would rise into the sky, followed by a series of secondary explosions, and then darkness, a hole in the convoy, a grave for hundreds of men. In those moments, Leo Nash from Cleveland understood that the front line was not some distant trench in Europe. It was right here, beneath the steel deck plates of his floating, fragile home. At his headquarters in a requisitioned chateau in Carnival, France Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz orchestrated his war with cold, mathematical precision. The walls were lined with massive charts of the North Atlantic, where pins and markers tracked the known convoy routes, the position of his U-boats, and the estimated tonnage sunk. For Dönitz and his staff, the Battle of the Atlantic was a war of numbers, a grand strategic equation they were confident they could solve. Their expectation of victory was rooted in the early successes of 1940 and 1941, a period the U-boat crews called Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. During this phase, British anti-submarine defenses were weak and disorganized. Experienced U-boat aces like Otto Kretschmer, Wolfgang Luth, and Günther Prien became national heroes, their faces adorning magazine covers. They prowled the approaches to the British Isles, sinking ships with alarming ease. They expected this dominance to continue. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 triggered a second happy time. Dönitz immediately launched Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, sending his long-range Type 9 boats to the American eastern seaboard. They found a coastline ablaze with city lights, ships sailing with their navigation lights on, and almost non-existent coastal defenses. The result was a slaughter. U-boats torpedoed tankers within sight of New Jersey beaches, sinking nearly 400 ships in American waters in just 6 months. This string of successes bred a powerful sense of confidence, even arrogance, within the U-boot Waffe. They believed their technology, their training, and their tactics were fundamentally superior. The Type 7 U-boat was a formidable weapon. Their G7E electric torpedoes left no wake, making them almost impossible to spot, especially at night. Their Enigma encryption machines were considered unbreakable, allowing Dönitz to communicate securely with his wolf packs across the ocean, directing them like a chess master. The German High Command expected the convoy system to be a difficult, but ultimately breakable defense. Their intelligence suggested that the Allies were struggling to produce enough dedicated escort vessels. The Wolfpack tactic was designed specifically to counter it. By concentrating a dozen or more U-boats on a single convoy, they believed they could overwhelm the screen of 6 to 8 escorts. The plan was to draw the escorts away, chasing after one U-boat while the others slipped inside the convoy to wreak havoc. They expected to pick off the merchant ships one by one, turning the convoy's defensive formation into a chaotic, burning graveyard. They anticipated losses, of course. It was a dangerous business. But they fully expected the exchange ratio, tons of Allied shipping sunk for every U-boat lost, to remain decisively in their favor. The Atlantic was their designated hunting ground, and they were its apex predators. They did not anticipate that the prey was learning how to bite back, armed with new teeth of its own. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 in early May 1943 would become the turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. It was the moment when all the theories, technologies, and tactics of both sides collided in a perfect storm of violence and desperation. The convoy consisted of 42 merchant ships, escorted by Escort Group B7, a mix of British and Polish warships. It was steaming into the teeth of a Force 10 hurricane and, worse, directly into the path of 3 waiting wolf packs, Fink, Star, and Amsel, totaling more than 40 U-boats. It was the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled to attack a single convoy. For Kapitän Lieutenant Hasenschar aboard U-628, the battle began on the night of May 4th. The sea was a maelstrom. Visibility was near zero. Waves crashed over the conning tower, making surface attack almost impossible. Yet, through skill and sheer nerve, several U-boats managed to penetrate the outer screen. The night was ripped apart by the flash of explosions. Star shells fired by the escorts cast a sickly flickering light over the scene, revealing the dark shapes of the merchantmen wallowing in the heavy seas and the sleek, low profiles of the attacking U-boats. The action was a chaotic, multidimensional melee. Aboard the destroyer HMS Aribi, the Aztec operator was desperately trying to distinguish the screw noises of a U-boat from the groans of the storm-tossed convoy ships. On the bridge, the captain strained to see through the spray, knowing a torpedo could be racing towards him from any direction. Suddenly, a lookout screamed. A merchant ship, the SS North Britain, erupted in a colossal fireball, its cargo of munitions detonating. It broke in two and vanished in under a minute. The U-boats had drawn first blood. The escorts fought back with savage determination. The frigate HMS Tay gained a firm sonar contact. The command was given, full ahead. Stand by depth charges. The ship surged forward, its hull shuddering as it raced over the U-boat's last known position. A pattern of 10 depth charges was rolled off the stern. The sea boiled as they detonated in sequence, a series of concussive blasts that could be felt for miles. Powerful enough to crack a submarine's pressure hull. Inside U-531, the world became a hell of noise and violence. The lights failed, plunging the crew into darkness. The boat was thrown sideways by the concussions. Pipes burst, spraying icy seawater into the control room. Men screamed as the pressure hull groaned, threatening to implode. On the surface, the crew of the Tay saw a surge of oil and debris, a confirmed kill. But the Wolfpack was relentless. Throughout the night and into the next day, the attacks continued. 12 ships from the convoy were sunk, sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. It seemed like a German victory, but the price was staggering. Escort Group B7 was now being reinforced by ships and, crucially, by long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft from Newfoundland. The hunters were about to feel the true nature of the trap they had sprung. The Allies were no longer just defending. They were actively, aggressively hunting. The German expectation for the Battle of ONS-5 was a repeat of past glories, a lopsided victory, immense tonnage sunk, and a confirmation of the Wolfpack's supremacy. The reality, which unfolded over 48 brutal hours, was a catastrophic shock to the entire U-Boot-Waffe. The hunters became the hunted, systematically and ruthlessly dismantled by a suite of new technologies and refined tactics they were completely unprepared for. The first surprise was radar. The U-boats were accustomed to Allied metric wavelength radar, which their METOX receivers could detect, giving them ample warning to dive. But many of the Allied escorts and aircraft were now equipped with new, high-frequency 10-centimeter radar. The German receivers couldn't pick up its signal. The result was terrifying. A U-boat captain could be on his bridge at night, confident of his invisibility, only to be suddenly blinded by the glare of a searchlight, the lee light mounted on an approaching aircraft, and showered with depth charges moments later. From his perspective, the attack came from nowhere. The second shock was the closing of the mid-Atlantic gap. The introduction of escort carriers like the USS Bulge and the proliferation of long-range VLR, very long-range, Liberator bombers meant there was no longer any safe space for the U-boats to surface and operate. Air power could now shadow the convoys across the entire Atlantic, spotting surfaced U-boats from miles away and vectoring the surface escorts to their location. The third and perhaps most decisive element was the perfection of Allied anti-submarine tactics, coordinated by superior intelligence. The Allies were now reading a significant portion of the German naval Enigma traffic, thanks to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. They often knew where the Wolfpack patrol lines were and could reroute convoys around them. When a battle was unavoidable, as with ONS-5, they could position dedicated support groups, hunter-killer teams of escorts not tied to the convoy's direct defense, to reinforce the screen and aggressively hunt down any U-boat that made contact. High-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, allowed escorts to get an instant bearing on any U-boat that used its radio, homing in on the hunters the moment they tried to communicate. During the final phase of the ONS-5 battle, this combination proved devastating. U-boats that surfaced to press their attack were pounced on by aircraft. U-boats that transmitted their position were hunted down by destroyers. The well-drilled escorts no longer waited for the U-boats to come to them. They charged out using radar and HFDUF to find and kill them. In the final accounting of the battle, the Allies lost 13 merchant ships, but the Germans lost 6 U-boats with 7 more damaged. In subsequent convoy battles that same month, the losses mounted. The month of May 1943 became known to the Germans as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. Donitz lost 41 U-boats in that month alone, a completely unsustainable rate. The tonnage per U-boat sunk ratio had collapsed. On May 24, 1943, Donitz, in a state of shock, conceded defeat. He pulled his remaining boats from the North Atlantic. The hunters had been decisively driven from their primary hunting ground. The tide had turned. The psychological effect of Black May on the German U-boat crews was immediate and catastrophic. The service, once the elite of the Wehrmacht, saw its morale collapse. Experienced crews and irreplaceable aces were at the bottom of the ocean. New crews, sent out with minimal training, were heading into a meat grinder. The Atlantic, once a place of glorious opportunity, was now spoken of in hushed, terrified tones. It was a watery grave. The confidence that had defined the U-Boot-Waffe was replaced by a grim sense of fatalism. But the most profound psychological shock was not reserved for the sailors at sea. It was felt by the German officers who became prisoners of war, men who had the chance to see the true source of Allied power firsthand. Consider the perspective of an Oberleutnant from the Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia in mid-1943. He had fought a war of scarcity, constantly hampered by a lack of fuel, spare parts, and reinforcements, all because of the Allied grip on the Mediterranean. His first encounter with the American war machine was the sheer volume of Allied equipment he saw at the front. His journey as a POW was the true education. He was loaded onto a troop transport in Oran, not a repurposed freighter, but one of hundreds of identical mass-produced ships. During the crossing, their convoy was vast, a testament to the victory so recently won in the battle he knew so little about. But the true revelation came when he landed in the United States and was put on a train for a POW camp in the Midwest. That train journey was a slow, rolling lesson in his nation's defeat. For days he stared out the window at a country not just untouched by war, but mobilized by it on a scale he could not have imagined. He saw factories that stretched for miles, their parking lots filled with thousands of workers' cars. He saw rail yards clogged with endless lines of new olive-drab hardware. Not dozens of tanks, but hundreds. Thousands. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and trucks, all sitting on flat cars, gleaming with fresh paint, waiting for a ship. He passed airfields where formations of B-17 bombers blotted out the sun. At a stop in Ohio, his train sat for an hour next to a highway. On that highway, he witnessed a convoy of military trucks. It never ended. For the entire hour, a steady, unbroken stream of vehicles, two abreast, drove past. He tried to count but lost track after 500. It was in that moment that the strategic reality became crushingly clear. Germany was fighting a war against soldiers.
America was a war.
Its power was not just in its armies, but in its foundries, its assembly lines, its limitless resources. The U-boats hadn't just been fighting the Royal Navy. They had been fighting the Ford River Rouge complex, the Kaiser shipyards, and the Chrysler tank arsenal. This was the ultimate shock. It was the dawning, soul-crushing realization that every U-boat success, every ship they had sent to the bottom, was ultimately meaningless. For every ship sunk, America built 10 more. For every tank destroyed in the Kasserine Pass, 100 more were rolling off an assembly line in Detroit. The war was not a contest of will or tactical brilliance. It was a war of production, and Germany had already lost before the first shot was fired. The convoys stretching beyond the horizon were merely the tip of an industrial iceberg that was destined to crush the Third Reich. The defeat of the U-boat in the spring and summer of 1943 was the most strategically decisive victory of the Western Allies in the entire war. It did not have the fame of Stalingrad or the cinematic drama of D-Day, but without it, nothing else would have been possible. The victory was not total. U-boats equipped with new technologies like the snorkel would remain a dangerous threat until the very last day of the war. But they would never again threaten to sever the Atlantic lifeline. With the sea lane secured, the trickle of American men and materiel into Great Britain became a flood. This was Operation Bolero, the largest logistical buildup in human history. The bridge of ships was no longer a metaphor. It was a reality. The ports of Britain swelled with American soldiers, vehicles, and supplies. The fields of East Anglia became home to the mighty 8th Air Force, which could now mount its devastating daylight bombing campaign against Germany without the existential threat of fuel and bomb shortages. The Soviet Union, fighting for its life on the Eastern Front, continued to receive vital supplies of American trucks, food, and raw materials through the treacherous Murmansk and Persian Gulf routes. Most importantly, the victory in the Atlantic made the invasion of Normandy possible. The D-Day landings of June 1944 required an armada of over 5,000 ships and the transport of millions of tons of equipment. Such a concentration of shipping would have been unthinkable, a U-boat commander's dream, had the Wolfpacks not been defeated a year prior. The success of the Battle of the Atlantic guaranteed that when the Allies hit the beaches, they would be supplied, reinforced, and supported by overwhelming material superiority. After the war, high-ranking German officials, including Dönitz and Hitler's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, would point to the failure of the U-boat campaign as a primary cause of Germany's defeat. Speer, the architect of the German war economy, understood the numbers better than anyone. He saw firsthand Germany's inability to match the sheer productive output of the United States. He recognized that the German war effort was an intricate, finely tuned machine, while the American effort was a force of nature, an avalanche of steel that simply buried its opposition. The legacy of this battle is written not in grand monuments, but in the quiet efficiency of global logistics that defines our modern world. It was a victory won by anonymous heroes, the code breakers of Bletchley Park, the scientists who perfected radar, the welders in the shipyards of Maine and California, and above all, the merchant mariners and naval escorts who faced the icy dread of the North Atlantic. They held the line in the darkest hours, ensuring that the arsenal of democracy would not be silenced. They built and sailed a bridge of ships across an ocean of fire, and in doing so, they carried the hopes of the free world to the shores of victory.